Michel. For me, the central question is whether Fukushima was a turning point in the quality of nuclear regulation. Now, there was quite a bit of hope on that moment. ENSREG offering a platform for closer cooperation. We saw the French regulator ASN pushing its strong position of stronger independence and larger transparency. And as the largest nuclear country in Europe, raising the bar in France could also raise the bar in Europe. We saw the European Council demanding a comprehensive assessment of all nuclear power stations in Europe. And we saw Germany removing the taboo on talking about shutdown if certain risk factors could not be excluded. NGOs, including the ones that I work for, and that's not only Greenpeace, but quite a few more, they constructively wanted to engage in that process. Was Fukushima a turning point in the quality of nuclear regulation? Well, we had a hopeful start. Coming September, the IAEA will issue its final report on Fukushima. And you will find there a quote from Yukiya Amano, the Director General, in which he states that a major factor that contributed to the accident was the widespread assumption in Japan that its nuclear power plants were so safe that an accident of this magnitude was simply unthinkable. Now, that assumption was accepted by nuclear plant operators, and it was not challenged by regulators. Let's take a look whether in the 4 years since Fukushima, this vital lesson has been learned in Europe by European regulators and authorities. For that, I first want to look at the European stress tests. Again, in that IAEA report, of which we received over Japanese press a leaked version, the IAEA concludes that safety improvements were not introduced promptly. You can think about the improvements concerning tsunami protection. Today, Greenpeace issues a report that was commissioned by Greenpeace, which assesses the updated national action plans in the nuclear stress tests. And in that, we see that a lot of timelines have been shifting. Timelines are not kept, they are prolonged. And too often, serious problems are covered with more studies rather than necessary upgrades. And I'm very happy that Andy Hall already pointed out to that issue. Producing a study does not improve safety one single bit. Now, in the European stress tests, we identified 4 years ago, on the same ENSREG conference, several holes. 2 black holes. We've identified 2 more. The first black hole that we introduced then was the one, oh, that's a bit fast. Seems there's one missing. Oh no, that's okay. This was the report, yeah. The first black hole is nuclear security. The IAEA criticized the situation in which several organizations with different roles and responsibilities in complex interrelationships led to a lack of clarity who was responsible for what and who could decide what. Now, that is also the situation with nuclear security in Europe. We had the European Council's ad hoc group on nuclear security, the AHGNS, I'll just call it the ad hoc group. They had a report, but that report was a dud. It was insufficient and it was non-committing. In the meantime, we see that there has been no Europe-wide cooperation between those who know something about security, that's the many security services, and those who know something about nuclear technology, That's you, the regulators. In contrary, ENSREG was kept out of the door of the closed ad hoc group sessions. In the meantime, we saw former Energy Commissioner Oettinger continue to state that aircraft crashes were part of the nuclear stress tests, while we all knew they weren't. We saw last year confusion around dozens of drone incidents in France and Belgium, a security issue. We saw the Spanish national authorities rather clamp down on our activists, the Cofrentes 17, demanding outrageous jail sentences and toughened penalties instead of going into dialogue with Greenpeace about the security issues they raised. Last August, the Hungarian nuclear regulator saw no problem in sending a trainload of spent nuclear fuel through a country in a state of civic war. Nuclear security is a problem, a daily problem, and we have not seen any step forward since Fukushima. Only the German Ethics Commission for Safe Energy Future seemed to accept that every nuclear power station in principle can be brought to a catastrophic situation with the use of internal or external violence, be it sabotage, terrorism or war. But in large, Europe continued with business as usual. The ad hoc group has not improved that situation in any meaningful way. Its focus was wrong, its lack of cooperation internally was wrong, its lack of cooperation with regulators was wrong, its lack of transparency and cooperation with civil society was wrong. That is more than disappointing, that is dangerous. The second black hole, emergency preparedness and response. We've already heard a bit about it. The IAEA will stress in September that defense in depth means improving mitigation measures. Because the ultimate mitigation measure of emergency response failed miserably for many people in Fukushima. And in Europe, the work on it came basically to a halt. We still see Antwerp threatened by aging power stations without an adequate idea how to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people within a matter of 2 days. Firefighters in the Panne still have no idea how to react when there is a multi-reactor accident in Gravelines. People in Luxembourg have easier access to iodine prophylaxis than their neighbors in Belgium when Cattenom faces a problem. Emergency drills in Slovakia are still communicated as sufficient when they only address INES 5 accidents. Do we really know how we will deal with an INES 7 accident in Mochovce? The Hungarian authorities plainly refuse to address emergency preparedness and response in any sufficient way in the PAX 2 environmental impact assessment. The UK ONR seems to condone the misconception that it would be impossible for Hinkley Point C to ever see substantial emissions of radioactive substances. Europe is still too scared to address the issue of nuclear liability. No one can count on sufficient compensation after an accident. We just have to draw that conclusion at this moment. The new nuclear transparency watchdog organization, Nuclear Transparency Watch, tries to push the discussion forward. But even 4 years after Fukushima, we've not been able to get national authorities make a full stress test of their emergency preparedness and response provisions on the basis of lessons of Fukushima. The third black hole. Fukushima hasn't ended. Also after 2012, there are lessons to be learned. I suppose you follow what happens in Fukushima, don't you? I do. Just a few out of many. What about post-emergency radioactive water management? Anybody done anything about it? What about building integrity management after natural disaster damage and or explosions? What about the need for availability and use of robotic equipment for investigation and measurement work, as well as for debris cleaning? Do we have them here? What about the need for availability and use of advanced modeling techniques? Are we going to repeat the speedy problem? What about the availability of sufficient and skilled and qualified workforce? Or are you also relying on your local form of yakuza and homeless people? Why are such questions not addressed in the national action plans? we're supposed to update them. Are regulators really learning organizations? The fourth black hole. We're nearing the end. The IAEA will conclude in September, it is essential that the regulatory body is independent. Now, this is enshrined to European legislation, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating, not in the recipe. I do see positive signs. The peer reviews sharpened minds. I see non-nuclear country regulators, Austria, Luxembourg, Greece, Ireland, forcing other regulators to justify and sometimes question their positions. I see the growing independence of the French ASN and IRSN, and they're pushing the bar high upwards for others. But we also saw that the Hungarian regulator sent the country's #1 nuclear promoter, Mr. Assadi, as its so-called independent experts to the peer review teams. By the way, Mr. Assadi is now the Hungarian government's salesman of the Paks 2 nuclear construction project. Assessing nuclear independence within ENSREG is difficult. He that is without sin amongst you, let him first cast a stone. St. John 9 verse 7. I understand that. So transparency appears to be the only tool that can shine a light on this issue. Let me give you some more light. The 2012 incredible revolving door case of Jukka Laaksonen of Stuk, moving without break to Rosatom. As a reaction, regulators from the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden and Belgium continued to try to convince me that revolving doors are inevitable in small countries. And my question is, are they really? The Swedish and Belgian regulator actively, in the last year, delivered advice to their governments how to circumvent greater and legally prescribed transparency around the issue of nuclear plant lifetime extension. I've got the letters here. The ESPO Convention prescribes, as we saw in Ukraine, an environmental impact assessment with public participation for plant lifetime extensions, irrespective of an unlimited operation license, irrespective of substantial physical changes, but simply on the basis of the fact that after 30 or 40 years, it is time to stand still and assess whether the world and the surrounding environment have not changed so much that we might come to new insights concerning risk, threat and safety. SSM and FUNK stand nothing to lose from an adequate level of transparency and public participation, only to win. The only one who now wins is the operator, in the form of less costs and less to discuss. Another bit of light. The stress tests surfaced the problem of the so-called reactive regulator. The regulator that has not sufficient human capacity in the form of skilled staff, not sufficient budget, not sufficient support from independent technical support organizations to be able to actively look for weaknesses, actively suggest improvements, or actively demand shutdown. Is it really sufficient when only ASN can boast such a proactive position in Europe? Is it really acceptable to wipe that aside with reference to different cultures? Transparency and public engagement only work when authorities are open to it. It is not sufficient that only shows in France with its increased independence of ASN, with its local information committees. And we still have serious concerns about France. ASN is under extreme pressure to cave in. Will it only look at the results of safety upgrades at this moment and not at the fact that 20 years lifetime extension to recoup investments will mean de facto a net increase of risk? The EBRD and Euratom make that mistake already in Ukraine. Will ASN stick to its advice to use the Hinkley Point C vessel head for destructive analysis? Funk is still doubting to demand the same from NG Electrabel in the case of the hydrogen flakes. The Czech SVAB states that original welding documentation is not necessary in case of an alleged faulty weld in the primary circuit. Will ASN survive such pressures? Well, we will keep watch, and I hope they do. But the rest of Europe's regulators are lagging miles and miles behind ASN. My conclusions. We need a more ambitious and thorough implementation of the stress tests. If the operator wants to do more studies, good. But shut your reactor down as long as uncertainties remain. Does the operator need more time to install filtered vents? Okay, shut down the reactors until that has happened. 2. Close the first black hole. We need a more serious, coordinated and open, yes, open assessment of security issues. And nuclear regulators should have an active role in pursuing that and not hide behind a lack of mandate. 3. Close the second black hole. We need a fundamental stress test of emergency preparedness and response for ENES 7 accidents. And regulators should have an active role in pursuing that and not hide behind a lack of mandate. Close the third black hole. We need ENSREG and all regulators to assess the Fukushima lessons from after 2012. Close the fourth black hole. Clean up our nuclear regulatory system of all remaining dependency from licensees and nuclear promoting structures. No more articles in nuclear promotion material. No more revolving doors. No nuclear gurus as advisors. We need open discussions with everybody with sensible input, also when they are critical about nuclear power. Get independent information committees, locally and nationally. Don't share the room only with pro-nuclear mayors. Become proactive instead of reactive. Don't be scared to be clear about consequences of non-compliance. Never again use the sentence, "We have to remain friendly, otherwise we do not get sufficient information." The Energy Union, the European Council and the European Commission call for Europe to have the highest level of nuclear safety in the world. If we take that seriously, we need nothing less than a sincere round of self-critical analysis within the world of ENSREG. We as Greenpeace and wider civil society are willing to help with that. Will you be too scared to invite us? I hope not. Thank you for your attention.